Evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nina Heller, the Dean of the UConn School of Social Work, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our kickoff event for the school's Black History 365 programs. And the title of our program is Black Lives Matter, Movement, Facts versus Myths. BH 365 was developed and led by the 2019 Graduate Student Organization leadership as a year-long campaign to promote visibility of Black history and the varied experiences of the Black community, and to give voice to the student experience at the School of Social Work. We will learn tonight about one of the most influential and critical social movements that I think will stand a test of time through the beginning part of this century. And I would also note that the Black Lives Matter movement aligns very well with the values, the mission, and the ethics of the social work profession. So we are very delighted to be sponsoring this tonight. And I want to thank you for being here and supporting our efforts. And we certainly hope that we will see you at our subsequent events throughout the year. We have a lot of great programs planned. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderators for tonight. Professor Anne Marie Garan, a nationally known anti-racism scholar and faculty member here at the School of Social Work, and Gabriel Mitchell, the co-chair of the UConn OBSWS group and chapter. We are really delighted to have you, and I'll turn it over to the two of you now. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight. We're so thrilled that you could tune in with us. My name's Gabby Mitchell. I'm a first-year MSW student at UConn. I am the co-chair of the Organization of Black Social Work Students, and my concentration is in individuals, groups, and families. In addition to that, I am a full-time social worker for the Department of Children and Families in Connecticut. And I also have been starting to get my feet wet with organizing. So in May of this year, I started putting together some rallies and marches for Black Lives Matter to spread awareness about police brutality and women's rights. And I actually met Miss Robinson through those efforts, and we've collaborated since. So I'm very thrilled that she's here tonight. I hope everyone enjoys the program, and I'm going to pass it to Anne Marie.
Thank you, Gabby. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very, very excited for this panel discussion. And so I'm just going to launch in and get us started. So it's been 7 years since the shooting of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, as he walked home from a local market. Since that time, scores of Black people have been gunned down, choked to death, or have died in police custody with very little investigation and very dissatisfying legal outcomes. Shortly after young Martin's death, the hashtag heard around the world became a worldwide phenomenon and movement. We have a criminal justice system that in no way is just, and an economic and social system that has been designated to criminalize and discriminate. Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, the movement's founders, pooled their experiences of activism and set out to dismantle these oppressive forces. The movement has become a lightning rod and a clarion call. Tonight, we are delighted that you've joined us for this panel discussion focused on Black Lives Matter. Our two speakers will demystify the Black Lives Matter movement and address popular misconceptions about it to give us a better understanding of what the movement is and what it is not. Through discussions of pivotal socio-political moments, the panelists will provide us with historical information and will give us information on how Black Lives Matter movements are active today in the Northeast of the United States and all over the country. So I would like to introduce the two panelists. LaShawn, could you give us a little overview bio of your experiences?
Hello, everybody. I'm LaShawn Robinson from Hartford, Connecticut. My experience, basically, I've been on the front line since I was at least 7 years old. In Connecticut, acts and attacks, when Dukakis was, in the front lines trying to run. So I came from that, and then I had friends and things like that that were killed by police at a young age. So I was in it at a very young age, but I came from Hartford Parent University. I'm a coach and a facilitator for them. And then I went on to become a Wayfinder Fellow and work for CTPU and a couple of other organizations. So I've been grassroots my whole life, basically.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Funk, would you like to introduce yourself, please? You're on mute.
Mike Funk, he, his, him. I am a self-proclaimed higher ed head. I've been working in the field of higher education in various capacities, from student affairs, academic affairs, and now as a faculty member for over 20 years. It's just a great pleasure and honor being in the room with a number of folks who are committed to social work. We need you more than ever in the helping professions. One of my roles about a dozen years ago was working actually with aspiring clinicians at Smith College School of Social Work, where they have, or at least had, an anti-racism mission. So I worked with a lot of the aspiring clinicians to help support them and negotiate issues of race and racism with their clients. It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank, and particularly Professor Marrero Johnson and one of my sheroes, and Dr. Anne-Marie Guerin. If you don't have this book, everyone needs this book. You might not be able to see it. It's called Racism in the United States, Implications for the Helping Professions, and particularly chapter 2 and 3, talking about the brief history of racism, white supremacy in the United States, and also the web of institutional racism, which is really, I think, what underscores our conversation today. So pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. And I did not pay him to do that.
Real talk.
That's right. So if you could get us started, Mike, can you give us some background of some of the social moments that have led us up to this moment of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yes, absolutely. And typically I'm not didactic, but I think in the spirit of really capturing a longer history of movements that have led up today, I think it's important in a lot of ways to document the years of resistance from folks from the African diaspora and ancestry. But one of the things I wanted to read, and this is from a book, which again, I implore everyone to get, called From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. And for me, this was really a grounding and a foundational text for me to have a better understanding in the larger scope of the current Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm going to read this passage directly because I think it's so timely. These are our bright years of emergence. Though they are painful ones, they cannot be avoided. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Blacks. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing the evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. Today's dissenters tell the complacent majority that the time has come when further evasion of social responsibility in a turbulent world will court disaster and ultimately death. America has not yet changed because many do not think it needs to change, but this is the illusion of the damned. America must change because 23 million Black citizens will no longer live supinely in a wretched past. They have left the valley of despair. They have found strength in struggle. Joined by white allies, they will shake the prison walls until they fall. America must change. And so that is actually a passage from Dr. Martin Luther King in 1969. This was written a week prior to his assassination. And so, you know, thinking in terms of, and I know particularly newer generations I work with, particularly primarily millennials and Generation Z, and I appreciate the racial awakening that has happened. But in a lot of ways, and I think what I want to call attention is we are really standing on the shoulders of giants, titans, heroes, and sheroes when it comes to this particular movement. And while we understand that this is not a movement, this is a movement, it also has unique characteristics. But I would also argue that really the Black Lives Matter started, many say 1619. I would say actually prior to that with the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, where 2 million Africans, before they even got into colonized settler land, were killed, right? We're talking about 10 to 15 million enslaved Africans that were transported to the America in some form or fashion, right? And so if you think of the earliest times in the US, right, the resistance, and so we're aware of many of the slave revolts and the told stories, but there are also many untold stories. So if we're talking about chattel slavery, which is unique in terms of any form of slavery, where people actually can be owned and their children can be owned by folks who claim to be their masters. This is a situation where Blacks were rendered to be 3/5 a human being, right? I think of the Igbo people in Savannah, Georgia, where 75 of them understood that they were being bought into slavery. And collectively, they walked into the water and did a mass death by suicide. So folks in New England, I know we say that like folks in New Hampshire live free or die, but these folks really embodied that concept, right? They understood that their lives matter, Black lives matter. If we think of Denmark Vesey in 1822, the insurgency of Nat Turner in 1831. If we think of someone we would call accomplice or co-conspirator today, John Brown in Harper's Ferry, where he led a revolt against slave owners, right? And let me get back to that language at some point as well when we do questions and answers. If you think of Sojourner Truth, who I think is really the godmother of this concept of intersectionality, Harriet Tubman. If we think of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, we're talking about 180,000 African Americans fighting for their own lives, right? For their own rights, for their own freedom. They understood that Black lives matter. This also proceeds, if you think was subsequently prior to that, you have up to 9,000 African Americans fighting in the American War. After, you know, as Du Bois would say, you know, and I think Michelle Alexander, which is another must book, The New Jim Crow, like captures it excellently. Every time there's like a little bit of sunlight or daylight, the goalposts get moved, right? So after the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, in kind of a period of self-determination for Blacks in the US, the backlash came in the form of Black codes. And if you think of like vigilantes and slave patrols, this is where folks, citizens were empowered actually to capture Blacks and make citizens arrest on Blacks. Labor laws were produced in the form of loitering. So if you couldn't get a job, then you would get arrested. And Blacks, particularly Black men, were basically relegated to farm jobs or a small amount of work that they can do. Situations that set up that they weren't necessarily employable. Poll taxes, literacy tests, voter suppression, things that should sound familiar. During that time of Reconstruction was also the emergence of the KKK, right? A white terrorist group. And if we think of Homer Plessy, right, he also understood Black Lives Matter. If we think of Plessy versus Ferguson, that was very intentional. Folks mobilized. Plessy at the time was considered 1/8 Black. So if you think of laws and legacies of hyper descent or the one drop rule, they knew he essentially passed as white. So they said, okay, brother from Louisiana, let's get him on the train and let's see what they do. Is he gonna have equal rights? And he was subsequently arrested. And so as some would argue, one of the most flawed Supreme Court justice rulings, you have apartheid in America as a consequence, right? So again, with the resistance, the backlash of oppression happens. If we move into the 20s and we look at the heroes and sheroes of the Harlem Renaissance, the Zora Neale Hurstons, the Langston Hughes, right? They understood that Black lives matter. If you think of Du Bois's concept of the talented 10, or Marcus Garvey, who had the Black Star Line and said, let's go back to our homeland, self-determination, one God, one aim, one destiny. He created the UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, understanding this is a way to enhance Black lives. Booker T. Washington, right, and his commitment to agriculture and pragmatic approaches to freedom and liberation. Now, they had various views, right, without a doubt. They were still invested in Black lives. You think of folks like Ella Fitzgerald, right, who performed in mixed audiences, but couldn't sit down and have a drink, was not able to be a customer in the audience that she performed at, for instance. In the 20s, we can't deny what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma with Black Wall Street, the racial cleansing and expulsion and murder of up to 300 Blacks, which at that time was one of the wealthiest Black cities to date, right, in US history. Moving into World War I and II, where whites were rewarded for their work, right, with the GI Bill, access to low mortgages, access to higher education at affordable, if not free rates, right? Simultaneously, fights were folks like Adam Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin were fighting to integrate those troops. I don't think it was until 1948 they argued with Truman for Blacks to fight integrated in the Korean War. You also had the Harlem Hellfighters, the 36th 9th Infantry. So Blacks are like sacrificing their lives just for their own dignity, just for their own quality of life, right? Just for the liberty, pursuit of liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. And so that was during a time where McCarthyism was true. And if you think of Du Bois, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Paul Robeson, these are folks who self-exiled because they understood that Black lives, in fact, don't matter in the United States. And so, and they understood that other places in the world either exalted, if not at the very least recognized the value of Black people and the contribution of Black people in the US. When we think of civil rights, I think often it's situated in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think Mamie Till, Emmett Till's mother, right? Emmett Till at the age of 14 was murdered in Mississippi for allegedly winking at a white woman. She decided to open the casket at the funeral because she wanted not only the nation, but the world to see that Black lives do not matter in the United States. During that time also, this is a little bit further in the 80s, you had the Move 9 with John Africa and Ramona Africa, where there was a helicopter that bombed the building that killed 6 adults, 5 children, and destroyed 65 homes. This is also throughout this, it's important to understand because the current Black Lives Matter movement is against, this is state-sanctioned violence. This is apartheid de jure, not de facto, right? This is discrimination, oppression, and violence by law. So if you think of SNCC, CORE, the SCLC, right? You think of King's Dream or Malcolm's Nightmare. Stokely Carmichael said it best when he said Black power, right? Or Black is beautiful. When James Brown said in the 70s, I'm proud and I'm Black, right? Those are echoes of a Black Lives Matter movement that we are carrying forward today. I think of the Combahee River Collective, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells. And so that was a movement that created integration and some form of assimilation. However, if you look at in terms of the US being an egalitarian society, Blacks in the US still have 1/8 of the wealth that their white counterparts have. And then when you move into the 80s, right? And so, and even in the 50s and 60s, you think of this notion of law and order and being tough on crime. And then in the 80s and 90s, you have Reaganomics, you have the crack epidemic, you have the HIV and AIDS epidemic. We understood in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, who did that most directly impact? It was the Black community, much like if we look at COVID-19 today, who is most directly impacted, I would say, is BIPOC folks, particularly Black and Indigenous folks, right? We had a hip hop movement in the forms of Black Lives Matter, right? Chuck D of Public Enemy, one of my favorite groups, told us to fight the power. That's Black Lives Matters. You had in academia, you had Kimberly Crenshaw, you had Derek Bell, you had the creation of critical race theory, which is now under attack from our current administration, right? So the common denominator, though, is resistance. And during that time, I think you also had Central Park 5. You had the murder of Abner Louima, right? And the sodomy of Abner Louima. You also had Yusef Hawkins, Sean Bell, who was killed murdered at his bachelor party, for instance, and several other high profile folks. Amadou Diallo, who was coming home from work and had a wallet and was gunned down in his own neighborhood. And so I think, and I was the first person, I'll tell you, when President Obama was elected, I was electric sliding down in Washington, D.C., right? So the party was real and the party was on. But what was in the landscape atmospherically, while there's this notion of post-racial era, there was still the prison industrial complex, where less than 1/3 of the population, right, makes up over 2/3 of the prisons, right? Search and frisk, war on terrorism, zero tolerance policies in the schools. So all of those were happening, right? And simultaneously, what was emerged, there were two things that happened in Florida, and this is kind of the double standards of white supremacy and oppression. On one hand, you had Trayvon Martin, and on the other hand, you had Marissa Alexander. And I don't know if folks remember, Marissa Alexander she was in a domestically abusive relationship with her partner. And so she was in his house and she fired some gunshots, purposely not to hit him, but to get his attention and essentially say, back off. As a result of her standing her ground of documented history of violence with her partner, she was sentenced to jail, whereas George Zimmerman was acquitted. And I think it was that a moment where Alicia Garza wrote a love letter to the Black community. Patrice Cullors # Black Lives Matter, right? And about a year later, we saw the gunning down of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson in the street. And he laid there for hours and hours. His father talked about pulling up to see if it was his son to rescue, to see what was going on, and they sicked the dogs on him. They criminalized his parents, and all they were trying to do was see their family. So Patrice Cullors at the time created a movement where there was a freedom ride, and that was involved over 500 people. At the time in Ferguson, folks mobilized, and this is, I think, the beauty and kind of the perfect storm of what happened with Occupy and it's kind of the strategies employed, older generation of civil rights movements that the younger generation learned from, and the power of social media to mobilize folks, particularly around this kind of leadership network, right? So I think 172 people were arrested in Ferguson during a week span, and 132 of those folks were just because of failure to disperse. And so from that movement became slogans like hands up, don't shoot, as a for instance. Then a year later, Freddie Gray happened. And people thought and understood, this is actually Black folks. This is a predominantly Black police law enforcement force, where they basically threw Freddie Gray in a van, whipped him around until, unfortunately, his tragic and untimely death, right? So we understood that even folks of color can reinforce, perpetrate, and internalize white supremacy in a particular way. Subsequently, Eric Gardner, right? We learned, I Can't Breathe, Oscar Grant, John Crawford in Ohio. Also in Ohio, Tamir Rice at 12, being shot down, right? And then the police did nothing, no phone calls. He ultimately bled to death. Tanisha Anderson, right? Sandra Bland. And so this kind of hashtag of say her name was a result of her death after a routine traffic stop. And then 2020, the reawakening. And I think even within that situation, as someone who had been working with students for a number of years, when I came back to New York University 2012, I would have considered my students as apolitical, disengaged, not civically engaged at all. So I think the Trayvon Martin movement was really a racial reawakening in the US. And with the Black Lives intersectional analysis, I'll also say this generation simultaneously was pushing against gender boundaries and gender dichotomies, and simultaneously also fighting and trying to preserve the integrity of Title IX and the cultural violence against women in our society, right? And so if you think of, for me, when I think of Black Lives Matter, it's not about wokeness, it's about praxis. It's about this reflective practice and action, right? And so there's an inclination to be group-centered instead of leader-centered, which is different than the past, right? And what I think is also quite, interesting is it also centers the stories and amplifies the stories of people in the Black community who are most disenfranchised or on the margins of the margins. So we're talking about queer folk, trans folk, we're talking about undocumented folks, we're talking about women, right? We're talking about folks with disabilities, right? And so it's a movement that seeks to move beyond nationalism, right? And instead, again, it really embraces intersectionality. And I'll say a little bit more about that later, but I feel like I'm a little tired of hearing myself talk and I want to make some room.
Oh, that was great. That was great. Thank you so much, because I think that historical overview is such an important piece of understanding this moment that we're in, and not only to provide an analysis of the moment that we're in, but to really understand the way that history does repeat itself. It's not just a saying, it really does repeat itself. And so many of the things that you were talking about that were happening in the 17, 18, early 1900s are things that in some form we are experiencing again now. So I think that was a really, really important timeline, historical timeline that you offered us, leading us up to the movement. So thank you. Thank you for that. LaShawn, can you talk a little bit about how you see the work that you're doing currently kind of under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter as one piece of your work, how you feel like that has helped to more visibly promote the more positive aspects of Black Lives Matter and try to dispel the myths that people have, that it's a violent organization, that it's a divisive organization. How has the work that you have been doing really tried to push forth the true Black Lives Matter agendas?
So for myself and our group, we have been doing a lot of stuff in the community. I know people get upset because people want us to just abolish the police, and that's just not our goal right now. We do still support those organizations. So we've been working with a lot of police departments in the state of Connecticut because they are the problem. So we want to try to fix the issues that's going on in the community with them. So we've had the opportunity to work with Hartford Police, going to meetings with them, putting our heads together, seeing what they have been proactive about, and coming up with new ways that we could have police address or be seen and viewed in our community. We had the opportunity to go to a cadet community training that was led in Hartford Police Department, and Black Lives Matter 860 went and spoke to the new cadets that are coming on, because we felt like that's very important to us in our community, and a lot of other people have not had that opportunity to meet with new cadets. And I feel like it starts right there, because if you don't have, if the new cadets already coming from somewhere else and just have this mindset of all Black and brown people are bad, then, that could stop some of that stigma. So they had the opportunity to be in our community, walk through the streets, like in the neighborhood, train in the neighborhood, and have us ask raw questions to them, and even people in the neighborhood that knew some of the officers. So I feel like, that's one of the stigmas. They think that everybody that's a part of Black Lives Matter hate police, and that's just not the thing. So having that network and relationship with them, we were able to do that. Also, we were able to lead art projects in the community so far. We did a big Black Lives Matter mural on Trinity Street next to the state capitol in Connecticut. And we brought in all types of community organizations and youth to come in and do the project, and the city was so open to it. We've also been working with the mayor in the city of Hartford and having meeting with a lot of state reps in Connecticut. Our president, Mikey Ortate, has been leading the meetings with the state reps. So we also played a role in trying to, we were one of the organizations that helped push to change the policy for police in Connecticut. And so, it's not just, we're here to start trouble or anything. All of our protests, we've led protests that was at least 5,000 people or more, and they all have been peaceful. We haven't had any violence or anything. Actually, the police were able to support us in that because that's their job, and it's part of our amendment. So we've had a lot of positives, and it shows that we're not a negative group. So we also have something coming up with a grant with an educational organization that's going to help fund internet across the state of Connecticut. So it's positive things that's coming out of it. It's just not a negative. We haven't done anything negative. We've been trying to work with everybody around us to make things change in our community, and including working with the surrounding towns. Because, people come into the city and want to change our city, but I think we're more comfortable with the police in the inner city. But the issue is when we go outside the city and go into the suburbs, so because we had the little network with Hartford Police, we were able to connect with some of the suburbs chiefs and have meetings with them too. So they could see how we feel about, commuting and things like that. So we've had a lot of positives, and Black Lives Matter is not what people are making it seem all over these different networks and things, and making it seem like we're just out to get people, and that's not what it is. We're going to fight for us.
LaShawn, could you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you've experienced, like maybe how some of the stakeholders have responded to your efforts, and anything like that within the context of the community, and any backlash you've received? And before you get started, just one thing, please use the question and answer box if you have any questions throughout this presentation that you would like to be answered. We are going to answer them as they relate to what our presenters are discussing. And if anything is not on the topic that we're covering at this moment, we will answer after. Thank you.
Yeah, so I feel like the biggest challenge that I ever faced, and the first time ever being an organizer for as long as I've been, as you know, I fought the racial quotas in the school by myself, basically. But the hardest thing was when we had younger groups coming up that wanted us to just abolish the police. And we knew that that would not happen in the United States because it ain't even for us. So that was the hardest thing, because it was a lot of like gossip surrounding it and politics, and it was very hurtful because we basically got shunned out of like certain protests where we were there supporting on our page. And I don't know, I'd never seen anything like this. And I've been to different places. As you know, right now I'm in Africa. So I've been to different places on the front lines, and I was very hurt because it was the younger generation, a little bit younger than me. And they just said a lot of nasty things because we didn't want to abolish the police with them. They were upset that we asked for police support, which I think that they were kind of confused that the police work for us, and I'm going to hold them accountable to do what they're supposed to do. The the next thing for me was I got appointed to the police review board, and all of a sudden while I'm here, I found out like on the internet and things like that, that the police review board was like dismantled, and they, I guess other people, like we're not appointed, and some politics going on with that. That's kind of hurtful coming from a place where I had friends that got killed in the streets of Hartford from police officers, and I lived it, and I feel like I got stripes and everything else because I've seen everything and had to fight. And I feel like as a resident of Hartford and all the things I've seen, even myself being brutalized and stuff by police, that myself or somebody else from the community should have had that seat. So to give something and take it back, take it away, that was really hurtful too. And just other people say they might not approve of the mayor, but I just feel like, it's our city and I'm going to hold people accountable. So I have to work with other people, and it doesn't matter if anyone likes it or not, because I know what I've been doing for years now. And, I just know how it goes, but it's very hurtful coming from people, the younger generation and people in the community that you thought you could trust.
Thank you for sharing. We have a couple questions that came in. One of them is, how do you think the new cadets responded to the experience? Do you think it's a program that could be recreated in other communities?
Actually, I have a sister from Wayfinders, and she actually did it in Minnesota. But I think that they responded pretty well. There were some cadets that were from different countries, and they just identified with a lot of things that we were talking about, and they were just right on point. There was a few cadets that were really quiet, and that kind of concerned me, because I felt like they weren't like participating as much. But it was a lot of back and forth going on and communicating. So the majority of them responded very well. And I think that they would take heed to what was saying and what the people on the street said to them. I think that it really touched them, because the cadets there were saying some of the things that some of the people, the officers in the neighborhood knew for years. Like they would come up to them like, hey, don't do that knee on the neck thing to us, or what you gonna do, and they were like saying the things that the people in the community was telling them on their walk to us. So I feel like they really received.
Thank you.
If I just can add, I'm going through a parallel process with one of my mentors and mentors. And so we are in the process of having some professional development conversations around racial justice with a police department in Western Massachusetts. So LaShawn, I completely agree with your approach to the work. So there's a couple of things that happened. So it was initially postponed because the day we were supposed to have our we'll just say the language of trainings, the Breonna Taylor verdict came out the night before. And so we just thought the tensions would just be too high. So we put it on pause or postpone it. And by the way, I'm much more a believer in postponing things than canceling things. Nonetheless, it was important though for me because it had us reflect on how we really want to do this. Is this going to be a quick fix, one conversation and they check the box? Or can we make this more sustainable? So as a result, we started interviewing folks from the community. We also interviewed officers as well. And we want to disseminate that information to invested community members, and also as well as the officers. Because I think what happens, and simultaneously, someone sent us a unanimous email that there should be no police training, where we wanted to fund the police, right? And so it was just very kind of this or that, not the and both. And for me, my philosophy is when there's tensions or conflict, you shouldn't censor or stop conversation. In fact, it should cultivate more conversations, right? And I think humanizing folks' experience is a really important aspect, right? Storytelling and being able to hear and listen to one another. So I think it's really important. I'm so glad that you're working with the younger generation, because I think a lot of folks are really set up in this conversation. It really is of this or that, and there's lack of nuance or complexity, right? And I absolutely believe the most important people in the conversation when it comes to police brutality is law enforcement themselves, right? Until they recognize, as an educator, if one of my peers or colleagues is not doing their job and they're sending harmful or doing harm in the classroom, I have no problem addressing that, calling them in and having a conversation. But there's so much entrenchment and perhaps so much at stake for law officers to do that with one another, right? And so until they're willing to do that, I agree there's going to be little change, but I think there'll be more investment if there's more of a collective effort. So I think there's a continuum, right? So there's aspects of abolishment of all of it, just eradicate all of it that works. And then me being more of a realist, I know that might be stretching too much, right? But I do like this notion of repurposing law enforcement, right? How can we think about it differently? Because what I'm learning from these conversations from them is, I mean, how many things? They have to be social workers, they have to write tickets, they have to be crisis interventions. There's so many things that they have to do at once. And it becomes in some ways like a working class issue or ethos, right? Where they're protecting more affluent upper classes, right? And so they're kind of pawns within themselves, even though some of them subscribe to the system. So I think it's really important that we broaden those conversations and have more conversations with the very people that we need to have them most with.
Thank you. Mike, we have a couple more questions, if you don't mind answering. Do you think the lack of a centered leadership is a disadvantage in this respect with being able to distance the movement from violence?
Is this for me?
Yes.
I tend to like it better. I don't know if I mentioned Ella Baker, right? And so Ella Baker is one of my sheroes of the civil rights movement. In fact, the civil rights movement, I would argue, probably wouldn't happen the way it did if it wasn't for her. And one of the things she was able to do, she was able to bridge the gap between the older generation, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? And she was able to have them have conversations with one another. And one of her mantras was saying, you know, she was behind the scenes. And she said, I don't want to be a leader, you know, as much as I want to instill and develop leadership in others. So I don't want to be the sage on the stage, right? I want to help work with, liberate other folks so we can collectively work together. So for me, it also is demonstrative of this notion, which is the Black Lives Matter, like the power of numbers, right? So if more folks see themselves, I think there's at least 38 organizations, as their own agents that have self-determination and autonomy within and understand the needs of their specific community better than one leader who might be representing all of them, or three leaders that might be representing all of them. I think it's not as effective. And so I think it related to the other question is what's hard is anyone can say their Black Lives Matter. I remember a couple years ago, there was a brother who was from the military, African-American man. He shot some folks from some police officers in Dallas, right? And people are like, oh, he was Black Lives, right? I don't think he was a part of chapter or anything. I think he might've had a shirt on or support them, right? So anybody can say that and do nefarious things, right? And so, and then there's a narrative or reputation that comes with it. But in terms of like durable, sustainable, generative change, in my mind, I think it's the best strategy to employ.
Thank you. LaShawn, I have another question. How does the Black Lives Matter manage, I'm assuming it's the local chapter, manage people who are saying they are representing the movement, but are not connected and are promoting violence? I know that you have a Facebook group and there's been some infiltration and different things like that. So maybe you could touch on that if you don't mind.
So everybody that has the name Black Lives Matter is not a part of the chapter, actually. And from our understanding, you have to follow certain rules to be part of the chapter. We are not part of the chapter. We do have a Facebook page. I think there's at least like 12,000 followers. And I'm not always on there because I have a lot to do. So we have admins and moderators, and we try to keep it clean as we can. But somebody is always a leak in the system. Somebody is always capable of changing a picture or making a fake profile and making a whole fake page and being able to, get and let in. Unfortunately, we can't watch all the time because we're working on new things. So we trust that the people that we leave to watch the page is trying to do as best as they could. If that answers the question.
Okay. And then one other question that I see here that you may be able to answer, LaShawn, is how does Black Lives Matter look different in Connecticut as compared to other states? What are the issues focused on here? So do you think that all Black Lives Matter chapters and movement are focused on the same types of issues, or do you think there's anything different that's going on in Connecticut rather than other places?
So I have a lot of my Wayfinder sisters that I do calls with that are in DC, Minnesota, LA, and they're all organizers. I think everyone looks a little bit different. I think a lot of it is for injustices, but I want to say, not to brag about my state, but I want to say in Connecticut, we're more focused on, like right now, we have different committees that we're working on, and we're getting people signed up for these committees, people from our Black Lives Matter 860 page. So we have like an education committee that's going to be happening, and mental health, prison reform, housing. We were like invited to a couple of like housing meetings and things like that. So I think ours is a little different because some of us have had experiences with education and things like that, and prison. So I think we bring something a little bit different to the table.
So rather than just focus on the movement itself, you guys are actually branching off into different areas and systems within the state to be trying to change it and sit at those tables.
Yes, and we also are trying to bring more awareness to the community about owning Black businesses. We've done a lot of Black pop-up shops throughout the summer, and we had like really big outcomes with that. And Mikey Ortate, the president of Black Lives Matter, he really orchestrated that with the team from Glastonbury. So I think we're definitely bringing something different to the table.
Yeah, I would agree. I did not give a shout out to the Black Panthers in 1966, so definitely shout out to them. And so I think the community empowerment, community-based organizing, I think of the free breakfast programs. I think those are the parallel similarity. I think they both have a race class intersectional analysis that bodes well. I do think that for me, my distinction is I'd see, even though you had Angela Davis, I think it's primarily Black led as an organization, the Black Panther movement. And so I think it centered that in a particular way. Whereas this movement, again, is less, and this is true of the civil rights movement. I think it's more kind of heteronormative, patriarchal movement, right? Even though I feel like they got class and race right. And so I think those are the distinction, right? There's it really, again, it's not Black Lives Matter more, it's Black Lives Matter too, and it really should be all Black Lives Matter, right? And how are we holistically looking at everything that impacts Black people in a particular way? And so I think the woman anchoring women voices in a particular way is different. And I think there's a lot of reasons why it's showing up with women leadership. It's always, women have always been right there in the mix. And often at the forefront, it's just those stories don't get told, right? And there are also, 1.5 million missing Black men. as Michelle Alexander talks about, right? You know, you think about there are more Black men in prison on parole or on probation than there were 10 years before the Civil War during the time of chattel slavery, right? So to be sure, you know, Black men are dying too early or they're being incarcerated too early. So that's also a part of the reason, I think, of the emergence, in addition to women just being outstanding and extraordinary, that's happening with the movement that makes it feel and look a little bit different optically than the Black Panther Party movement.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions. Anyone's free to answer. In the history of organized government, has there ever been a peaceful revolution? And if we continue on this peace first movement and we continue to be unheard, what do you suppose are the next steps?
No justice, no peace, huh? You know, when I hear that though, peace is beyond just like physical action, peace of mind, peace of emotions, peace of spirit. No justice, no peace. I think I subscribe to a multiple pronged approach. I think in the end, it's just much as I agree. Like if you think of the Tea Parties and the Boston Tea Party, Crispus Attucks, by the way, in the middle of that, another Black person, right? Understanding Black Lives Matter. You know, it was part of the revolution. There was violence. But for me, violence ascribes to white supremacy, right? I think it compromises my humanity. I'm speaking for me, right? To be physically violent towards someone that is not a matter of self-defense. If it's a matter of self-defense, that's a whole different conversation. I feel like for me, that's justified, right? That's in fact justice. But to cause harm or damage to someone, even as I'm being physically oppressed, I'm not necessarily sure that would be my approach. And again, I think there are ways that can be useful strategy to employ, right? It's just not one that I would subscribe to. Other thoughts about that? I'm curious, because it's, right? What's Audre Lorde? How can you dismantle the master's house using the master's tools? And in this instance, the master's tools are the military, automatic weapons, tanks, right? Is this how do we want to become? This is what we need to be careful about. Do we want to become the people in the system that we're critiquing, right? Is it a matter of taking over power to become the same people that we're critiquing, right? So I think those are important spiritual questions, ethical questions to ask.
When you say that, it reminds me because, you know, here in Nigeria, what's going on with the protests, and it was peaceful protests, but when I'm here, I'm just like internalizing, like, oh my gosh, like it's police officers that look like us that have shot and killed people here. And I'm always thinking like Africa is the escape for me and my family. But just like internalizing, I'm just like, is it just really going to be peaceful here too after I see seen what happened yesterday and today? I just really don't know which way it's going to go. I keep thinking that it might end in violence all the time when I think of the US, because it's like it just won't stop. It's like, is it ever going to end?
Yeah. There's a group that's showing up in a lot of these protests called, excuse my language, Not Fucking Around Crew. And I don't know if folks have seen that. It's like intergenerational, cross-gender, and, you know, I'm not mad at them. That they actually, to me, are very similar. I don't know ideologically where they stand, but in terms of their position around self-defense and being ready, they remind me of the Black Panther Party. And LaShawn, to your point, you know, I also have romanticized Africa as well. And then I've traveled with students and stayed a significant amount of time in South Africa, right? In a lot of ways, speaking of parallel processes, like they're 30 more, we're about 30 years ahead, although it feels like we're 30 years now behind them, given the current administration, in terms of their own liberation, right? But it's unbelievable, right? Where 90% of the population only owns 10% of the land, right? So you can be surrounded every day with folks like you, and it doesn't mean that you still can't be rendered powerless or marginalized, even as the majority.
So I just have a follow-up question, I think, comment maybe about the peacefulness versus the violence, because so much of what has happened in many cities around the country is that these protests that were initially peaceful have devolved into severe violence, and that then gets associated with the movement. And so what are some of the ways that we can really talk about how this movement is not one that purports violence as the way, when all of this violence is occurring at the same time? And sometimes that violence is in response to aggressive police stances, that it's, sometimes it is people who have come looking for trouble and just wanting to smash windows. But other times, as we've seen in Portland and in Minneapolis and many other cities across the country, that protesters have been moving through peacefully and that they've been aggressed upon for no apparent reason by the police. So how do we then talk about that when we have so many people saying, see, this is what they're doing. This is what they're trying to get us, they're trying to foment violence. So what are some of the things that either of you thinks that we could say in response to that?
I guess I would say there's always going to be agitators. Even when we did protest locally, people that weren't from our neighborhoods were vandalizing things. It didn't end in violence, but still, if you're spray painting Black Lives Matter everywhere, then it looks like, we're doing it. I just want to say there's always an agitator, even in a crowd of people that don't look like me. There's agitators. We've been to counter protests, and it's the people on the other end, like they say about us, that is agitating. The other side is being peaceful. So I would just say, if you doubt it, then just put boots on the ground and go see for yourself. And then you could form your own opinion after.
I'll let that stand.
Thank you. Gabby, it looks like there's a couple more questions. Do you want to?
Yes.
With those?
So one of them is, how would you respond to someone putting out inflammatory information like Candace Owens' commentary about Black Lives Matter to help people to see how dangerous and wrong this is?
Mm-hmm. So I would encourage anyone just to Google Candace Owens, right? And kind of looking at her agenda. Clearly she is an opportunist. That's a euphemism for what I would probably say a grifter in a lot of ways. I mean, mind you, she's also kind of buys into this post-racial, colorblind, not my language, colorblind ideology, yet she sued her hometown in Connecticut for racial discrimination against her for the sum of $37,000, right? She was anti-Trump. She was anti-Tea Party. Trump gets elected. She's now pro-Republican, right? So, she leaves clues everywhere to where she's at, right? Do I think she's harmful? Absolutely, because I think, and I don't really like talking about right, left, but I do think people tend to weaponize her, right? And so this is with whataboutism, or, you know, she happily accepts this kind of being positioned as a token, right? And so since this Black woman is saying that this must be true. But these are typically people who refuse to kind of do their own research, like a simple Google of who Candace Owens is. And there's folks, if you get a chance, Dolly Chugg, she does a lot of work around implicit bias and dialogue. And one of my takeaways from what she kind of encourages, like as an educator, she has this like 20, 60, 20 rule. And so there's 20 people, 20% of the people kind of already have this awareness. Again, I'm not into this notion of woke. I think like the wokest among us still falls asleep once a day. So we never really arrive at this work. But 20% of the people are in the conversation. And then there's 60% of the people who could kind of go either way, might be a little bit more malleable. So if I get into Facebook battles or Instagram battles, that's who I'm doing it for. I'm doing it for like the 60%, right? And then there's about 20 other percent. It doesn't matter what you share, what empirical evidence that you provide for them, what they see right in front of their eyes. It doesn't matter. They're going to believe what they want to believe as well. So I think it's, you know, I don't hold my breath oftentimes when it comes to this. It's like work or educate where it's deserved, not necessarily where it's needed.
Thank you. And our other question is, how has the passage of the Police Accountability Bill in Connecticut affected Black Lives Matter 860 in police relationships, if at all? Do you think that this bill will help advance Black Lives Matter priorities in Connecticut and Hartford?
I don't know. I'm kind of up in the air about the bill. Some things weren't great with it that didn't go through, but I feel like it didn't affect the relationship with ourselves and the police. I feel like if anything, us having that initial meeting with HPD and keep networking with them to find solutions for the community, I feel like it just made us stronger. Even to the point where I'm able to, like if somebody calls me in the neighborhood and something happens, I was able to intervene before it got too crazy with the police. So it hasn't affected us because I feel like the good officers know that they need to be held accountable. And if you don't have anything to hide, I think the old sergeant from state police mentioned it on the news some months back, that if you don't have anything to hide, then it's not nothing to worry about when it comes to that bill. So.
Thank you.
So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit, either one of you, just about moving the ideas that you've been talking about tonight around advocacy and organizing, moving that to the federal level, because Michael, you've referred to the current administration a few times in terms of lack of leadership and just how problematic they've been towards any and all of these movements. But when we're looking at the different layers that we have to really move through in order to see change, we've got the local level. And I think, as we can see, people are organizing all over on the local level, but kind of moving up the chain, how is it that we can try to work with folks at these higher levels in the federal government in order to receive the message and be so moved by it, or to start to understand the significance of it in more authentic ways?
I love it. These are the easy questions. Thanks for the layup. That was so slim. We want simple answers for complex questions, right? I think we all have our different spheres of influence, right? And it can be overwhelming and seemingly insurmountable. I think I go in ebb and flow feeling like it's just too much. I can't do it, And so I think that could be defeatist. As King says, I'd rather see good defeated than evil triumphant, right? So what can you do? Again, it's really on a local level to a large degree, right? I mean, particularly like this current administration has their hands all in my pocket around work around diversity, social justice work, inclusion, belonging. This is language that now you can no longer say on a college campus without worrying about your funding getting pulled, right, in a particular way. So we just need to be more creative, innovative of how we're going to be subversive, right? So how are we working around the particular system? The easy answer is vote, right? And pull other people. I mean, that's one of the things about the movements, right? If we talked about kind of resistance and action, is voting. That is consistently a theme around Black Americans, and something that they work towards is voting, right? And so what I have take notice of, it may not be the 2 candidates, 3 candidates who are running, 4 candidates running for president, but on a local level, who's now on city council, right? Who's a representative in the House and Congress, who's now in the Senate. So politically, and I used to be, I'm very still concerned with politics, but I do think that, it's really important. And again, it's just, I think of the Jimmy Stewart movie, was it Miracle on 34th Street, which is a black and white movie, right? And now that movie is in color, right? And it's the same movie, it's the same story. So just having folks in color doesn't necessarily mean that the system's going to change if people are still playing by the same rules of engagement. We need to really support, the AOCs, the younger generation of politicians who are really reimagining what politics can look like and supporting them. So I would say that's the most immediate solution, is on November 3rd, right? And then outside of that, I'm an educator, right? So my lane is not being on the streets, right? Of course, that's something I've done. I have my own receipts for it, but today that's not where my efforts lie. My efforts lie in the classroom and educating people around these issues. Many of the folks on this conversation are social workers. I mean, write about this stuff, creating policies. How are you interacting with families? How are you conducting your work, right? How are you holding one another accountable as a profession, as a community, as an institution? Those are important things to think about. So not necessarily thinking about directly the executive branch as much as everything more so locally.
Thank you. LaShawn, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just agree with the voting. We've been working on Get Out the Vote. We've had a lot of voting registration tables set up at our events, and they're actually doing one now and tomorrow. So I think what Mike said was important about the voting right now is the only way. And we do have people that's interested in running in city council, and running for a government seat, hopefully. One of our Black Lives Matter 860 people will get through. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
We have one other question that came in. Understanding that Black Lives Matter is always going to bring a lot of criticism, do you think that people involved in Black Lives Matter spend too much time defending the group instead of just going out and doing the work?
I can answer that. Like I said, I'm hardly ever on social media defending it, because I feel like I'm always doing the work. Even if you don't see me behind the scenes, I'm doing the work with the children and the community. Even pre-COVID, always having restorative circles with the children that I work with and my own children at home. And having restorative circles with my family about the issues that are going on. So I'm never really wasting time explaining it. If you don't get it by now, from all that you have seen, then there's nothing else that I could tell you.
True, thank you.
I think that's a helpful thing to say, LaShawn, because I think for so long, before we were in this current moment, so to speak, that those of us doing the work have spent so much time trying to explain reasons to other people of why we think the way we do, why we act the way we do, why we don't do. And it seems like we've just kind of shifted and moved into this place where we're not explaining that anymore. If at this point in 2020, you don't have that baseline similar to my baseline, we're just going to move on. It feels like, we're less conciliatory and more about just come on with us or stay behind, that I'm not going to spend as much time as I used to try to coax you along or to try to cajole you along. And so I appreciate your saying that, because I do feel like there has been this notable shift, and some people are coming along and some people are still dragging their heels or staying behind, in whatever bygone era they choose to be in.
Yeah, and I think it's making a difference in so many ways that I wouldn't imagine in my lifetime. I mean, ever since the murder of George Floyd, and the world essentially got to see 8 minutes and 48 seconds of police brutality. I mean, never in my lifetime did I think that they would remove the Confederate flag, for instance, in the way that they have. A couple of years ago, Dan Snyder, the owner of the Washington team, said, "I will never, ever, ever change the name of my football team." And what has happened, right? To watch the NBA and WNBA championships in the bubble, and to see Black Lives Matter on the court of the playoff game, to see a tennis player who won, right? Was it the US Open? Actually cancel her match because Black Lives Matter, and then win. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing, right? And some folks are real believers in Juneteenth, and that may be amazing within itself as well, that now that's a national holiday. For others, maybe that's not so important. But nonetheless, this has all transpired in a matter of months, right? And so I think it's also important that we celebrate the victories that have happened as well, just even in the past few months.
Yeah, you just brought a story to my head. When we did the Black Lives Matter mural on Trinity Street, I was so surprised. I received the email from a public defender that represented me. I went through this big thing where I helped a kid that was getting choked by this guy, and then it reversed on me and I got arrested, and it was just crazy. And I had this public defender, he was pretty new in our court system, and I wasn't sure, and I knew that I would not bow down and just take a plea or anything because I didn't do anything wrong, but help a kid. And this guy really fought for me, and I was just like to him, like, oh, I'm an activist. Y'all didn't want me to do this, like, because I didn't do anything wrong. And for him to come back, he really worked with me, and I got everything that, was dropped and things like that. But he sent me an email and was like, hey, like, I seen the mural that you led, and this was amazing. And I'm so proud of you. And I knew, like, I just can't believe that you were, we represented you. And he did this big old poster, him and his team, and it was like Public Defenders for Black Lives Matter. And they had a little parade and everything. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, I never thought that I would see something like that coming from Hartford, where a lot of police, when I was younger, and public defenders were dirty. I was just really touched by it. So, like Mikey said, the change has been happening. That really, like, that did something for me to see people do that. A bunch of Caucasian men at that.
Thank you for sharing that experience. One other question we just got in. There is a notion of all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. What is the best way to educate people? We understand it's not a debate, nor should it be, but what is the best way to navigate those difficult conversations?
It's a great question. And it also is a question that has me at odds with folks in my community that seemingly we are on the same page. So I'm for Black liberation, I'm for Black joy, but I'm also for social justice. And if you're for Black empowerment, human rights for Blacks, but practice homophobia or ableism or sexism without apology or remorse, then we're not on the same team. We're simply not on the same team. And I do think that is the shortcomings. I mean, in a lot of ways, how the ideology of these three sisters and how they've conceptualized the movement is, to me, what I can only dream of, right? Because I always felt like that was the shortcoming of the civil rights movement. And so the metaphor I often give is similar. I mean, I used to say the flu, I might as well say COVID, right? And so COVID, like, so oppression as a virus, and racism is one element of it, right? So when you get COVID, some people get a fever, right? Some folks cough, right? And that's patriarchy and that's sexism. Some folks have trouble breathing, right? And that's probably heteronormativity or normalcy. What are some other symptoms? People get weak, right? And that's classism, right? And so you have to treat all of it, right? You can't just look at one aspect and say, I'm only going to look at racism. I'm only going to look at classism. Black folks, I don't live in a vacuum. You know, I have a gender, I'm cisgender. I have a sex, I have a sexuality, I have a religion, right? That's what makes me who I am as a multidimensional person who's Black, right? And you have to celebrate all those aspects of me because that's what's going to help me live, and that's what's going to capture my Black joy. If I can't have dignity in all parts of who I am, then that's not a movement that I want to be a part of, right? And so hence the notion of all Black lives matter. And I also think that's where you get buy-in for allies as well, because that's where you see folks, this is where the coalition building happens across movements, which the Black Panther Party did a great job of doing too, across races, transnationally as well. So I think that's the value of, again, building power in numbers, is developing compassion for other identities outside of your own, which I might even be privileged in, and being able to kind of meet folks where they're at in different aspects of who they are. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. LaShawn, do you have anything to contribute, or did Mike cover it?
Right, I mean, even like you're thinking of trans folks, right? If you think of a group that's most in harm, that people know least about in terms of how they're overrepresented in being murdered or killed in the US, right? And so how can, I don't understand how folks can't see that this is why, you know, I don't want to get into name calling. I have a really challenge with Dave Chappelle, actually, because I feel like he has an incredible analysis around race and around class, particularly white working class folks. But yet he continues like willful neglect of spewing and espousing hate, right? And othering folks from identities or that are most marginalized in our community. And so we just got to do better. We got to do better. Oh, last thing I'll say, you know, and this is true, like Smith, and this was my critique of Smith at the time. I have a lot of critiques of Smith, but I'll save that for another day. But what I did appreciate is they had an anti-racism mission. But imagine as a social worker, particularly a clinical social worker, and you go through 3, 4 years, 2 years of rigorous study around different populations that you're going to support. And all you can have is an analytical lens of race, right? Then you are clearly not doing a service to the clients you serve, because they're not just race. There's other identities that impact them. I've always encouraged Smith to look at more of a social justice one, right? And it doesn't compromise centralizing race. I think you can, like, that's intersectionality. CRT centralizes race as a point of an analysis where you can then learn about other ways of how the tentacles of oppression impact different people in various ways. So again, there's a lot of this kind of dichotomist, this or that thinking instead of and both. And I see Black Lives Matter as an and both approach to doing the work.
So if you were to each identify 2 or 3 things that you see as the work moving forward, and I know some of this might feel like it hinges on the results of the election, although I'm not so sure about that. But 2 or 3 things, even things on your kind of wish list, moving forward, next steps, either locally or nationally for the movements. Do you have any thoughts about what things you might like to see?
I don't know if this pertains to this, but I know for Black Lives Matter 860, I would like to see differences, the difference in education. That's been my battle for a long time. I fought the racial quotas in the magnet schools here. And I'm just at the point now that since we're doing online learning, most of us, I'm at the point that I just want to make my own curriculum for the kids in my community and start doing our own schools and own, you know, I know it's been done already, of course, but just thinking of creative ways to just keep my children and other children in the community that struggle at home, because, and building my own curriculum, like I said, because it's just, education is a piece of this whole Black Lives Matter thing too. Kids are facing so much injustices in schools. Just knowing that Connecticut had the racial quota on the books, that Black and brown children basically wasn't good enough to have magnet school funding alone. I want to see that change. I want to see us as a community and Black Lives Matter 860 do something more when it comes to schooling. And our vice president, Natalie Langlease, did the whole, she was the parent that led the whole remodel for the Martin Luther King School. So us as parents, we're struggling here in Connecticut when it comes to education. And that's something that I want to really work on. And the prison reform. I don't want to take up all the time, so.
These are excellent. I really appreciate hearing this, LaShawn. Excellent. And it helps me think about this too. You know, I'm really, really concerned. You know, on one hand, I think this moment offers a lifetime worth of possibilities for us to radically reimagine how we're doing things. I mean, if COVID hasn't revealed nothing else, it's clearly an indictment on capitalism and white supremacy. And if we can't see how unsustainable that is now, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to see it. So what can we do differently? And maybe I'm Pollyanna or naive. Like, even in terms of, my son is in public school here in New York City. Like, why can't we just call a timeout for a year? We already know that is complete inequity within the public school system, within the school systems. And yet, how much is that going to be exacerbated if some folks are in class now, some students are getting tutoring, some students have little or limited access to the internet, right? What is that going to look 5 years from now if we don't do something? So there's a couple of things. Like, one is around accountability. I think for too long, police officers that have done harm, that have been lawless, have done so without impunity or some type of accountability. So I would like to kind of eradicate that immunity that they have, right? And so, you know, for us, and people always say Blue Lives Matter. Well, the truth is, when people kill police, people get indicted, they go to jail, justice is quote unquote served, right? So I think accountability for actions around law enforcement. I'm thinking of restorative justice, right? Restorative justice in terms of, I know prison is supposed to be rehabilitative, but recidivism is still at an all-time high, if not worse than ever. How can we create, decriminalize poverty, decriminalize substance abuse, right? And decriminalize mental health, right? And so how can we kind of flip where our money is spent and again, reimagine and value the importance of a social worker, of an educator, right? Folks who are the essential workers on the front line. So, just more radical reimagining, more accountability. And I think it all really needs to be anchored with social justice. Restorative justice and social justice. But my sense is we're all, folks are fractured. I'm fractured. I feel wounded. I'm beat up. I think everyone is like mildly sedated and depressed on a day-to-day basis. And so how can we begin a process of collective recognition, acknowledgement, and healing? And I know those are kind of pie in the sky visions, but it certainly is my vision. Maria, on
You're muted, Anne Marie.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And I think at this point, we're going to wrap up. So we would like to thank so much LaShawn Robinson and Dr. Mike Funk for your time and your wisdom this afternoon and this evening. I think that everybody who has attended has learned a great deal about history, the history of social movements, how we got to this moment today, how in some ways it's a renaissance of a moment that has been happening since 1619 and before, and that there are multiple ways that we can be involved. There are ways that we can organize, that we can reach out, that we can be activists in this movement. So thank you to both of you again. And also thank you for the audience. We really appreciate the questions. We had great questions, and we're really appreciative of your attention as well. And so thank you for taking the time this evening to attend. One thing before I close is that BH65 is also planning an event on the principles of Kwanzaa. And so look out for advertising that we will have soon around that event, which we'll be holding in early December. And we're also doing planning for the spring as well. And so please be on the lookout for those events and information about those events as well. I think that's it. I think we're good. So once again, I will bid you all good evening and thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you all. One love.
Good night. Thank you.